Today, we are wrestling with a classic of alternative economic theory, a book that treats the very foundation of American monetary policy less like a sober financial institution.
And more like a carefully concealed conspiracy, really.
That's the one. We are undertaking a deep dive into G. Edward Griffin's definitive work, The Creature from Jekyll Island, a second look at the Federal Reserve.
And the book's premise is, let's say, bold. It doesn't just critique the Federal Reserve, it frames its secret creation and subsequent operations as one of the greatest whodunits in modern history. It fundamentally challenges what Griffin calls the accepted monetary myth.
Okay, let's unpack this enormous claim. Our goal today is to synthesize the book's core, highly complex arguments into a clear, structured narrative. You might be prepping for a meeting, or maybe you're just intensely curious about this topic. But regardless, this is for the learner who wants deep, fast knowledge on this incredibly influential subject.
And Griffin is definitely known for this kind of intense, detail-oriented research. He has a history of diving into difficult subjects, international banking, the history of taxation, even terrorism,
Right.
and then presenting them with unusual clarity. The book's endurance is pretty notable, too, having reached its 33rd printing by 2012. Its arguments have clearly resonated powerfully with a large segment of the public, folks looking for an alternative explanation for how our economy actually functions.
So we start not in Washington, D.C., but on a remote, guarded Georgia island back in 1910. Let's begin at the genesis of the creature itself.
Yeah, the initial premise of the book is almost like cinematic. The year is 1910. The first chapter of The Journey to Jekyll Island details the extraordinary level of secrecy involved in transporting 6 of the most powerful men in American finance to Jekyll Island, Georgia.
Using Senator Nelson W. Aldrich's private rail car, no less. And when you say powerful, we really need to appreciate the sheer magnitude of the wealth concentrated in that one rail car. The source estimates these 6 individuals collectively represented a financial power that totaled perhaps 1/4 of the entire world's total wealth at that time.
Staggering, really. That level of concentrated power operating in absolute stealth. It's quite a detail.
So who are these key players?
The key figures included Senator Nelson W. Aldrich. Now, he wasn't just a senator. He chaired the powerful National Monetary Commission, was a close business associate of J.P. Morgan, and crucially was the father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller Jr.
Quite the connections.
Absolutely. Then there was Paul Warburg, who Griffin describes as the intellectual engine of the whole plan, the master theoretician. He was connected to the formidable German Warburg banking consortium.
And they took almost absurd measures to ensure their cover wasn't blown, didn't they?
Oh, completely. We're talking about participants traveling under false names, not speaking each other's full names aloud in front of the train crew or servants.
Communicating only in code.
Yeah. Why? The total commitment to secrecy. Why not just lobby Congress openly? It's a fair question.
Right.
They understood fundamentally that public perception would just ruin the project instantly. Griffin quotes internal sources confirming that if it were publicly known that this specific group, Wall Street's reigning elite, had got together and written a banking bill, that bill would have no chance whatever of passage by Congress.
Because the populist anti-Wall Street sentiment was so strong back then.
Exactly. Especially after the financial panics of the early 1900s. So the appearance of public interest was absolutely paramount. Their official cover story down in Brunswick, Georgia.
A weekend of simple duck hunting?
You got it. Duck hunting.
Okay, so if the ultimate goal was definitely not duck hunting, what were the practical challenges this wealthy cartel faced that necessitated creating this secretive, centralized structure? What were they trying to solve for themselves?
The book argues that the Federal Reserve was engineered to address 3 primary, let's call them existential challenges these mega bankers faced. It frames the whole project as compulsory cartelization aimed at self-preservation, essentially.
Okay, let's run through those 3 core objectives. What was number 1?
First, they needed a foolproof way to stop the growing influence of small rival banks. The existing system allowed for competition, and they needed to centralize control over the nation's financial resources firmly in their own hands, basically creating a banking monopoly.
But under the guise of creating stability.
Precisely, using state power to eliminate free market threats to their dominance.
Makes sense. What was the second objective?
This is maybe the most crucial one, especially when we look at modern history. They needed a mechanism to convert inevitable banking losses coming from, say, reckless lending or bad investment decisions, into liabilities covered by taxpayer money rather than their own funds.
Ah, the seed of the modern bailout.
You could say that. This is where that idea really takes root, according to the book.
In other words, privatizing profit, socializing risk.
Exactly. And the third objective was perhaps the biggest political hurdle: how to convince a deeply suspicious Congress and public that this entire plan, driven by Wall Street's elite, was actually designed to protect the public interest.
Right. Selling the creature as a benevolent guardian, not a cartel enforcer.
Was the challenge.
Which brings us to the actual strategy of deception. They had to mask the structure of power while manipulating public sentiment. How did they manage to pull off this strategic sleight of hand?
The strategy was multi-pronged. First, they knew they absolutely could not call it a cartel or a central bank. Those terms were deeply unpopular, going way back to Andrew Jackson's time.
So they needed a friendlier name.
Right. Instead, they would call it a Federal Reserve System. That gives it a veneer of government authority while making it look decentralized through regional branches. It suggests it wasn't dominated by New York, by Wall Street.
And they deliberately capitalized on public fear and anger from recent crises.
Precisely. They used the fear caused by recent financial panics to generate popular demand for urgent monetary reform. Then they brought in prominent university professors, academic experts, to lend credibility to their specific proposal.
So getting academic approval for what was, according to Griffin, essentially a private banking plan.
That's the argument. Many of the early pioneers of the economics profession apparently participated in legitimizing the system's birth.
And here is the truly Machiavellian detail mentioned in the book: the intentional public opposition from the very men who designed it.
Yes, the final and maybe the cleverest step. They planned to have prominent Wall Street bankers publicly speak out against the Aldrich Plan, which was the initial version of the bill.
Why? To convince the public.
To convince the public that the financial elite definitely did not want this new system. This strategy of deliberate misdirection, this false opposition, proved enormously successful in calming political fears about it being just another banker's dough.
Okay, so they create the legal framework. Now we move on to the function of the creature, what the book calls the Mandrake Mechanism. The source claims that modern alchemists have succeeded where the ancients failed, converting metaphorical lead into gold. What exactly is this new alchemy Griffin describes?
The new alchemy, detailed extensively in Chapter 10, is the ability to create fiat money. That's currency designated as legal tender just by government decree.
Not backed by gold or silver.
Exactly. And thus it provides an endless, elastic source of capital for those who control the mechanism. The startling assertion the book makes is that without this ability to create money out of thin air, most modern large-scale wars simply wouldn't have happened. The massive debts just couldn't have been financed otherwise.
That's a fundamental claim. If this power leads to war and inflation, we really need to understand the mechanics. How does the Mandrake mechanism actually work, in simple terms? What makes the system fundamentally different from traditional lending, where you're using deposits that already exist?
The book emphasizes a very precise, almost paradoxical statement. Money is not created first, nor is debt created first. The two are born simultaneously. Griffin states, "It is the act of borrowing which causes it to spring into existence, and it is the act of paying off the debt that causes it to vanish."
Okay, wait, let me make sure I grasp the core difference here. If I deposit, say, $1,000 in a traditional bank, like the old goldsmiths, and they lend out $900, the total amount of money in the economy remains $1,000, right? Just held by two different people.
Correct.
So if I deposit $1,000 in a fractional reserve system, like the Fed enables, what happens then?
Okay, under the fractional reserve system authorized by the Federal Reserve, that $1,000 deposit is categorized as a bank liability. The bank has to keep a small fraction in reserve, say 10%, which is $100. Now, they can lend the remaining $900. But here's the key, that $900 is not taken from your original $1,000 deposit. The bank simply creates brand new $900 entry, essentially out of thin air, as a liability on its books, and an equal $900 asset, which is the loan itself.
So that $900 is new money added to the total supply.
Exactly. And when the borrower spends it, it likely gets deposited in another bank, and the process repeats. That second bank can now create 90% of that $900 as new money, and so on. It's a multiplier effect.
So the banks are effectively collecting interest on principal that literally sprang into existence the moment the loan was signed. It cost the bank basically nothing except maybe some keystrokes.
That's the argument. It inherently alters the risk profile for the bank. It fundamentally changes the risk-reward calculation. The bank profits immensely from this creation process itself. And as we established when talking about the Jekyll Island objectives, the ultimate risk of loss is suspended because there's this expectation or mechanism to eventually transfer that bad debt to the taxpayer via bailouts.
So the nation's money supply just increases, and banks collect interest on funds that cost them virtually nothing to make.
That's the core of the Mandrake Mechanism as described in the book.
And this inherent instability, this ability to inflate the money supply, this was historically prevented by the gold standard, which the book frames as the enemy of the welfare state.
That is the essential political connection the source makes. Historically, the presence of a gold standard, like the one backing the Greek drachma, which ensured long-term price stability for centuries, acted as a kind of fiscal discipline.
Like a brake on spending.
Pretty much. Once a nation abandons gold, it loses this discipline. The government is essentially given a blank check to finance any debt or project it desires through the mechanism of inflation by just creating more money.
And Alan Greenspan, interestingly, before he became the famously cautious Federal Reserve chairman, voiced an extremely candid opinion on this very matter back in 1966, didn't he?
He did, yeah, years before his Fed tenure. The book quotes Greenspan, writing that the abandonment of the gold standard made it possible for the welfare statist to use the banking system as a means to an unlimited expansion of credit. He went on to describe this mechanism as a way to confiscate, secretly and unobserved, an important part of the wealth of their citizens through inflation. Since the dollar was entirely separated from gold in 1971, the U.S. has uniquely been able to finance decades of massive trade deficits. With this newly created fiat money, an advantage, the book argues, no other nation can replicate.
It sounds like a sophisticated version of a very old game, really. Only the technology of creation has changed.
Indeed. The book draws a really striking historical parallel to the fiat currency system established by the Mongol Khan centuries ago. Both systems, Griffin observes, rely on paper that costs basically nothing to make, are accepted under duress or a government decree, and are created in such vast quantity that the government can claim the total output equals all the world's treasures.
So our current Federal Reserve note system.
The source argues it's an almost exact replica of the monetary system used by those ancient warlords to command economic power.
Okay, so if the creature can magically create money and take interest on it, the next logical question is, what happens when they inevitably make bad loans? Which brings us directly to the concept Griffin titles, the bailout game.
Right.
The book argues the entire system is designed to reward recklessness by converting massive, uncollectible private debt into interest-bearing assets guaranteed by the taxpayer.
That transfer of risk, the conversion of private loss into public, interest-bearing debt, is presented as the logical operational consequence of the original Jekyll Island plan. Once money is created essentially without cost, the lending behavior can become reckless because the ultimate risk of loss is politically suspended.
And when the failure inevitably occurs,
The private entity unloads the debt onto the public balance sheet. That's the core argument.
let's examine how this mechanism worked in practice according to the book. Starting with the Penn Central Railroad crisis in 1970, the source presents this as one of the early tests of this system.
Yeah, the Penn Central saga serves as a pretty clear demonstration, according to Griffin. Congressman Wright Patman, summarizing an investigative staff report at the time, described a situation where a close-knit club of bankers and management actively allowed corruption and mismanagement to basically destroy the company.
With the attitude that,
The cynical attitude that the railroad and the public be damned. So when the railroad is facing imminent collapse, threatening default on billions in loans held by major banks, Congress immediately passed the Emergency Rail Services Act of 1970.
which authorized federal loan guarantees.
Exactly. It authorized $125 million in federal loan guarantees, effectively putting the burden of the banker's poor judgment directly onto the shoulders of the American taxpayer. The financial losses were socialized instantly.
And just a few years later, the same mechanism was deployed for New York City in 1975, which was teetering on bankruptcy due to extravagant spending and a sprawling bureaucracy.
Right, the NYC crisis demonstrated how quickly a domestic fiscal issue could be elevated to an international threat to justify federal intervention. David Rockefeller, who was chairman of Chase Manhattan then, actively persuaded international figures, including Chancellor Helmut Schmidt of West Germany, to publicly state that a default could trigger a devastating international financial crisis.
That seems like pretty intentional fear-mongering designed to create urgency in Congress, doesn't it?
Griffin argues it was absolutely intentional. Faced with this manufactured international panic, Congress quickly authorized $2.3 billion in direct Treasury loans. That substantially increased the debt guaranteed by the federal government.
And the core objective was achieved.
Yes. Interest payments on the old, potentially defaulting debt held by private banks resumed immediately, paid for by the U.S. Treasury. The banks were made whole.
Okay, wait. Conventionally, when we discuss the subsequent savings and loan crisis of the 1980s, we usually blame pure greed and the high-risk junk bond market, led by Michael Milken. How does the book reconcile that conventional explanation with the idea that federal regulation was actually the root cause?
That's a really crucial point, where the source challenges the consensus narrative. Griffin claims the real fundamental problem wasn't just greed, it was government regulation itself. Specifically, the rules that removed risk for depositors, turning them into kind of complacent creditors.
Because their deposits were insured.
Exactly. And accounting gimmicks that allowed insolvent firms to hide their balance sheet problems for years. The junk bond market, while risky, was actually seen as a separate threat to the established megabanks because it allowed smaller independent companies to access capital outside the traditional Wall Street investment houses like Morgan and Rockefeller.
So when the S&Ls did start failing, the government-backed Federal Savings and Loan Insurance Corporation, the FSLIC, stepped in. But not just to fix the problem.
Not just to fix it, but to channel cash to specific firms, according to the book. The FSLIC arranged heavily subsidized mergers, offering healthy firms cash settlements running over $1 billion per year by 1984 to absorb the insolvent ones. The system was essentially designed to prop up the insolvent structure with taxpayer funds, continuing the bailout game on an even grander scale.
Okay, let's fast forward to the 2008-2010 bailouts. The scale became so immense that the creature's function as a money machine became pretty undeniable, even on an international level.
Oh, absolutely. The book details the sheer magnitude. Citigroup required a $45 billion bailout. Bank of America received $15 billion. Even GMH was restructured specifically to become eligible for federal guarantees.
But the true expansion was international.
That's where it really took off. When the IMF bailed out Greek banks in 2010, the U.S. taxpayer contributed 20% of the funds. But even more significantly, the Federal Reserve acted unilaterally, announcing it would bail out European banks without requiring specific congressional approval. It integrated the program with the central banks of Canada, England, the EU, Switzerland, and Japan.
So the Fed, in essence, truly became
a money machine for the world, as the book puts it.
This functionality seems to rely on intentional policy shifts, which brings us to the argument that the Fed has, at least once, deliberately sabotaged the U.S. economy for external reasons, specifically leading up to the 1929 crash.
This takes us back to the secret diplomacy between central bankers.
Yeah.
The source details the relationship between Benjamin Strong of the New York Fed and Montague Norman of the Bank of England. In the mid-1920s, Great Britain was struggling with a weak reserve position.
Okay.
The culmination of their efforts, according to Griffin, was a secret meeting in 1927.
To be absolutely clear here, the source suggests that in 1927, the U.S. Federal Reserve intentionally created economic volatility, specifically inflation, to help the Bank of England. That sounds like an act of financial war against its own citizens.
According to Griffin, that was the calculated intention. Governor Strong needed little convincing, the book claims, to deliberately create inflation in the U.S. so that American prices would rise, making U.S. goods less competitive in world markets and causing American gold to move to the Bank of England. This policy apparently reversed a previous declining trend in prices.
And the effect?
After the Fed began buying government securities to inject money, stock prices soared by 20% just from July to December 1928. This created the speculative bubble that then burst spectacularly in 1929.
And while the public was being reassured that the Fed was a safeguard against calamity,
the insiders, the architects of the system, were quietly making their exit. That's the pattern presented. The Federal Reserve itself issued an advisory on February 6, 1929, telling its member banks to liquidate their holdings in the stock market. The following month, Paul Warburg, the master theoretician from Jekyll Island, gave the same private advice, warning that the ultimate collapse is certain.
Yet public assurances of stability continued.
Right up until the point of collapse, according to the book. This ensured the public remained fully invested while the financial elite protected their own assets.
Okay, when you put all those pieces together, the intentional financing of the Soviets, the calculated entry into WWI, the deliberate manipulation of the 1929 market Griffin, is suggesting a level of elite coordination that, frankly, most people would dismiss as pure fiction.
It's definitely a controversial interpretation of history.
Now we broaden the scope even further, linking the central banking mechanism to a much larger global political agenda, which the book roots in Fabian socialism. What's the connection there?
That's the crucial pivot in the argument. The book identifies the ideology behind these international financial structures as Fabian socialism. This was an elite intellectual movement primarily in Britain. It was characterized by its symbol, the turtle.
Because it sought slow, gradual change.
Exactly. It aimed to bring about socialism gradually through propaganda and legislation, rather than quickly through violent revolution, like the Marxists advocated.
And how did this gradualist approach apply to banking and governance, according to the book?
They realized that the public would likely oppose outright state control of industry. So they used social benefits as camouflage, things like welfare programs, national medical care, improved working conditions to gain popular support for policies that inherently advance state control and centralization.
And central banking fit into this.
The creation of centralized financial institutions was seen as essential for managing the massive welfare state debts that would inevitably result from these programs.
And this ideology, the book claims, permeated the creation of post-WWII institutions like the IMF and World Bank at the Bretton Woods Conference.
Absolutely. The two key architects named are John Maynard Keynes, the well-known British Fabian socialist, and Harry Dexter White, the Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury.
And the book adds a significant and very controversial footnote about White, right?
It does. It states that White was not only connected to the Council on Foreign Relations, but was also identified as an alleged member of a communist espionage ring operating in Washington. The book claims the FBI reportedly informed the White House of his activities, but he was still appointed to this critical role in shaping the post-war financial order.
So if we accept the book's premise here, the purpose of the World Bank was not just global aid, as it's usually presented.
No. The World Bank was primarily viewed, according to Griffin, as a vehicle for moving capital from industrialized nations, specifically the United States, to underdeveloped nations, the very regions where Marxists historically had the greatest control and influence.
And the expectation was
That the U.S. would essentially pay their bills, often absorbing significant losses on these loans. The IMF operates similarly, funded overwhelmingly by industrialized nations, with the U.S. contributing the most, often making up for other nations that contributed, quote, worthless currencies.
What's truly jarring in this section is the repeated pattern described of financing regimes that were clearly hostile to American interests or even engaged in massive human rights abuses.
Yeah, the pattern, particularly regarding developing nations, is laid out explicitly. The book details how regimes notorious for mass detentions, torture, and human rights abuses, listing specific nations like Tanzania, Uganda, Zimbabwe, continue to receive millions in World Bank funding throughout these periods of abuse.
How is this justified by the people running the bank, according to the source?
When confronted, a bank manager reportedly explained that, quote, political distinctions are not something our charter allows us to take into account.
Regardless of the regime's actions.
The ultimate result, however, as argued by Griffin, is that the IMF World Bank system literally buys these despotic countries into the emerging New World Order using U.S. money. The financing buys cooperation and dependence.
And the inclusion of economic giants like, say, Red China and the former Soviet bloc in the list of major, often delinquent borrowers, that signals the final phase of this process.
It signals the final consolidation, according to the book. It argues that China and the former Soviet bloc quickly became the biggest recipients of this credit. The totalitarian despots become content to be, quote, little gold-plated cogs in the giant machinery of world government, so long as the sweet cash keeps flowing. Ideological conflict becomes secondary to financial centralization and control.
And the brain trust responsible for implementing this gradualist Fabian plan within America itself is identified as the Council on Foreign Relations, or CFR. Tell us more about the book's description of this entity.
The CFR is described by Griffin in pretty stark terms as the hidden government of the United States. Its membership list reads like a who's who of elite power. Presidents, cabinet members, Federal Reserve Board members, university presidents, and critically, heads of major media networks.
And its goal.
The goal of this group, according to the source which cites its own founding documents, is the termination of national sovereignty and the creation of world government. They utilize gradualism and deception, ensuring public opposition is minimal by avoiding confrontation until it's basically too late.
Okay, now we really have to address the most dramatic claims in the book. The alleged role of these financial elites in orchestrating major global conflicts, starting with World War I. How does the book claim bankers got America to abandon neutrality?
The book argues that the narrative against Germany was heavily shaped by the Morgan and Rockefeller groups, which it claims controlled key media outlets like the New York Sun and the Wall Street Journal. The pivotal event cited is the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915.
Which wasn't just a passenger ship.
Correct. It was carrying significant amounts of contraband, munitions, consigned through the J.P. Morgan Company.
And the specific explosive claim about the sinking?
The source alleges that Winston Churchill, who was then First Lord of the Admiralty, made a calculated decision to call off the destroyer escort assigned to protect the Lusitania.
Why would he do that?
The calculation, according to Griffin, was that the destruction of a British ship carrying American passengers would so inflame U.S. passions that it would guarantee American entry into the war. This, in turn, would ensure the safety and repayment of J.P. Morgan's massive loans to Britain and France. The protection of their financial capital was the primary driver for pushing the U.S. into the war.
That is a staggering claim of manipulation for profit. And this pattern allegedly extended to the Bolshevik Revolution, which the book claims was financed by international financiers who were supposedly anti-socialist capitalists.
This is presented as a classic example of what the book terms the Rothschild formula, working both sides of a conflict to ensure continuous control and profit, regardless of the outcome. The leadership and the financing of the Bolshevik Revolution, Griffin asserts, came largely from outside Russia.
Who were the backers named?
Principal backers mentioned include Jacob Schiff of the powerful Kuhn-Lobenko Bank in New York and Lord Alfred Milner of the British Round Table Group, who reportedly spent over 21 million rubles financing the Russian Revolution.
So the point is...
The point the source makes is that strong support for Bolshevism came from the very highest financial centers, from men who, by conventional definition, should have been communism's mortal enemies.
And this pattern, the book claims, continued right into World War II regarding the financing of Hitler's war machine.
Yes. The book alleges that German industry, particularly the massive chemical and industrial conglomerate IG Farben, was heavily financed by American and British bankers. This includes names like Rockefeller's National City Bank, Morgan's Equitable Trust, and Kuhn-Lobenko.
And Farben's role.
Farben was not only a primary source of political funding for Hitler, according to the book, but was also central to the Nazi war effort, even operating slave labor camps like the one at Auschwitz III.
And the controversial link during the war itself, how did finance influence military action?
Critically, during the Allied bombing raids, the book claims that IG Farben factories were conspicuously spared heavy Allied bombing. The reason given, that the U.S. War Department, which determined bombing priorities, was liberally staffed with personnel who had come directly from these very investment firms that had financed Farben.
Specific names mentioned.
Yes, the book names individuals like Robert P. Patterson and James Forstall, who came from firms like Dillon Reed, highlighting the deep financial ties between the institutions that financed the German war machine and the officials who decided which targets to bomb, or perhaps not to bomb.
Wow. Okay, that brings us to the future. The projected outcome if the systemic trends of centralization, control, and debt creation remain unaltered, according to Griffin. The book projects a realistic scenario involving a devastating global banking crisis. How does that unfold?
The scenario begins subtly but accelerates quickly. It starts with rumors spreading of simultaneous loan defaults and a major corporate borrower defaults at the same time. Defaults large enough to wipe out the entire net worth of a major U.S. bank.
And that triggers panic.
Exactly. It triggers a global electronic virus of panic and institutional distrust. Treasury and Fed officials offer maximum reassurance. But because of the history of deception outlined in the book, no one believes them. Trust evaporates.
And that failure of trust leads directly to civil unrest.
Right. Bank closures, massive queues outside banks, violence erupting in cities. The National Guard gets called up. And here's a crucial social observation the book makes. The people, terrified by the breakdown of order, are actually grateful for the omnipresence of the police state when martial law is declared. They start demanding law and order over freedom.
And following that crisis, the banks get bailed out, of course, and then partially nationalized. But the ultimate control mechanism described is a new global currency system.
This is presented as the final phase of control. The book predicts the mandatory introduction of a global digital currency system, possibly called the Bancor. Critically, cash transactions larger than, say, 5 Bancors would become illegal.
Everyone gets an account.
Every citizen would be issued an account in a government-regulated bank. The whole mechanism relies on a personal ID card tracked by a new international agency, the UN Monetary Transaction Tracking Agency, or MTTA.
And why is that system described as the ultimate control?
Because the ID card would be required not just for all economic transactions, but also for all geographical movements. It ties your money, your location, and your political compliance all together in one system.
The stated goal is one thing, the real target another.
Exactly. The stated goal is to combat counterfeiting and money laundering, but the real targets, according to Griffin, are political dissidents and anyone operating in the underground economy. Furthermore, the banks are now completely safe in this scenario, as it's physically and legally impossible to demand physical currency. There can never be another run on the banks.
And this projected crisis aligns with what the book calls the doomsday mechanism argument. The idea that the decline of the U.S. is not accidental, but is actively being engineered by, well, CFR-affiliated leaders.
Yes, the underlying thesis there is that the New World Order cannot fully succeed as long as the U.S. retains the power and sovereignty to go it alone. Therefore, weakening the U.S. economically and militarily becomes a prime directive, coming from within its own leadership structure.
Achieved through specific economic policies.
Well, Griffin points to things like environmental regulations that drive heavy industry overseas, extremely high taxes, and perhaps most critically, a demographic shift where more people receive government checks than actually pay income taxes.
Creating a dependency cycle.
Right, creating the point of no return where the majority actively plunders the minority via the ballot box, ensuring perpetual fiscal instability and dependence on the centralized government.
So if the problem is presented as deep and systemic, what does the book actually prescribe as the path forward? What's the solution?
The book is extremely precise about what not to do first. Don't turn to the government for more cures, it says, as they created the problem. Don't just audit the Fed, because it's doing exactly what the law allows. The fraud, the book argues, is legally sanctioned and plain to see if you look.
And don't just nationalize it.
Right. Don't simply turn the Fed over to the Treasury. Citing the Bank of England's post-nationalization history as a precedent, the book argues that function is more important than ownership. The government would simply continue to use the Mandrake Mechanism to create money for political purposes, regardless of who technically signs the checks.
So the only viable solution offered is pretty radical, nothing short of abolition.
That is the ultimate goal prescribed. The complete abolition of the Federal Reserve and its siblings, which Griffin identifies as the income tax, the controlled media, as he sees it, and the UN's absorption of national sovereignty.
And for personal survival during the predicted transition?
The book advises financial diversification, avoiding popular, high-performing investments which may be due for a sharp fall, and holding a 2-month stash of physical cash or old silver coins, just in case the electronic system collapses temporarily or permanently.
But the most important step, the foundational action required, isn't financial or legislative, is it?
No, it's educational. The book stresses that the single most important step is spreading the word. Americans, it claims, have allowed their nation to be stolen from right under their noses, not due to a lack of power, but because they did not understand what was happening.
So an awakening is the first step.
An awakening of America and the world to the true nature of the creature, as Griffin presents it, is the necessary starting point for any realistic plan for survival and change.
Okay. The book's thesis is undeniably clear. The Federal Reserve is, according to G. Edward Griffin, an effective, successful banking cartel masquerading as a public protector, financing globalist and socialist agendas, and must be abolished to restore economic and personal freedom. That's the argument in a nutshell.
It's a powerful conclusion, certainly. And if we connect this grand global structure back to the earlier moments of American monetary history, it does recall the warning given by Andrew Jackson when he fought against the central bank of his own era, the Second Bank of the United States.
What was his specific concern?
He was concerned about a bank almost wholly owned by the subjects of a foreign power, being more formidable and dangerous than a naval and military power of the enemy. That foreign influence and concentration of power worried him deeply.
Which raises a final provocative thought for you to consider. If Jackson was concerned about the concentration of power and potential foreign ownership back in the 1830s, how far has that concentration advanced today, given the global reach, the legal secrecy, and the fiat money creation powers of the creature from Jekyll Island, as described by Griffin?
It's definitely a question that demands a very serious look at our current monetary reality, however you interpret the evidence.